Okay, so let's start with the groups that did prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. Can we have each group maybe throw out one idea that they had on how each would be affected? Anyone want to share? Okay, let's zoom in here. So I think there's also groups from Boris's class, but no one wants to share one of these that they wrote. Okay, I'm going to just pick one then. Eukaryote cell division would be affected, leading to unwanted mutations. Definitely. Prokaryotes have higher heat sensitivity, meaning eukaryotes would start dying off first. That's great. They can, because of the way that they reproduce, they often have those mutations that allow them to live in those high heat environments. So they might be able to survive, or eukaryotes have harder times doing that. What about unicellular versus multicellular?
Well, as it gets hotter and like more mutations start happening, multicellular organisms have more like chances to go wrong, mutate.
Yeah, they have more cells that could mutate. Anyone else from a different group or the same group have another point to make? What about reproduction-wise, unicellular versus multicellular? Sometimes they differ between asexual and sexual reproduction. More often, multicellular organisms produced by sexual reproduction. Could that be a benefit to them? Well, I'm not sure what everyone else thinks, but for multicellular, if they are reproducing sexually, that might heighten the chance of a advantageous mutation. More variation, meaning more evolution or possibilities for evolution. Whereas unicellular, usually they're just making clones of themselves. So if something goes wrong within that clone, then they might not be able to come back from that. Let's move down to animal versus plant. What do we think?
My team went like more vaguely, and we said it's gonna, well, with natural selection, like some species for animals aren't going to be able to survive in like the new heat, and because it's like going to change their environment. So yeah, they're going to have new mutations, and the organisms who can't keep up are probably going to die, and yeah, natural selection will happen.
Yeah, great. Yeah, evolution does not happen very quickly a lot of times. So if they can't, like you said, keep up with that, they would die off. Any other points that anyone wants to make? Something to do with both might be breeding seasons, right? If plants are blooming earlier or animals are going in heat earlier, that might, global warming might have an effect on that too. They may have less time for mating or fertilization. Lastly, endoderm versus ectotherm. Sorry, endotherm versus ectotherm.
Well, our group, we looked up a bit more about ectothermic animals. And one of the things we read was that ectothermic animals' metabolic activity goes up with higher temperatures. And so that could lead to an increase in metabolic activity means that these animals need more food and energy from their environment, which could bring imbalance to the ecosystem that they live in and the food resources that are present within that ecosystem.
Definitely, that's a good one.
We also saw that it increases aging by telomere shortening for ectotherm, so that's not a good thing.
Yeah, definitely not a good thing. Great. Any other comments overall? It is just a really important thing to think about, how global warming will affect at so many different levels. Okay, we are going to take up some of the questions that were left last Wednesday. Throw out any answers that you might have, and then we're going to go through a few that we have came up with. The first question was, how do macromolecules contribute to the structure and function at other levels of organization? So above the level of macromolecules. Anyone have examples for this?
Well, everything's made of proteins, right? So like they necessarily affect other levels.
Yeah, proteins are a big player for cells. They make up a lot of important things. Can anyone think of one important protein?
Enzymes?
Definitely enzymes. They are very helpful at other levels of organization. Okay, we have a few different ones. The first one that we came up with are cellulose. Anyone remember which macromolecule that is?
Is that glucose? Bunch of glucose?
Yes, it's made up of a bunch of glucose, but which macromolecule? So we have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins.
Oh, carbohydrates.
But you're right, they are made up of glucose subunits. And cellulose is responsible for making those cell walls, that really strong support. It allows plants to stand upright. Can anyone think of an advantage to that for plants? Why would they need to stand upright or grow tall?
Get more sun.
More sun. In animals, there's, like was said, proteins play a huge role in many things. Enzymes is one. Also in making up of different tissues. So if we focus on cartilage for one example, cartilage is made up of collagen protein fibers. So here's collagen, which you can see, made up of those and often a mix of other fibers, other protein fibers, sometimes elastin fibers. Now, cartilage is responsible for a lot of things in the human body. It's more of that flexible support. So in between our joints, in our nose, we see it, in our ribs that attach them. It's also seen in fetal skeleton. That's somewhere else you see cartilage before it ossifies to bone. Some organisms even have cartilage for their skeleton. Instead of like us, they have that more flexible supportive tissue of cartilage as their skeleton. The more elastin fibers you have, the more flexible the cartilage. So for example, our nose isn't as flexible as our ear. We can bend our ear a lot. Our ear is also made up of cartilage, but it has more elastin fibers within it. Third example, again, proteins. They are responsible for changing shape and allowing movement. There's quite a few examples of this. One might be to transport materials along the cytoskeleton. Another might be the cilia found in the trachea. So whenever you breathe in, these cilia are consistently moving. They're fluttering around, moving any debris out of your respiratory system. Here's a real picture. So all of these little hairs, they're all made up of proteins. Another huge example is the sperm and its tail, made up of proteins. And muscle contractions are also because of the way proteins move within each other. So when it contracts, all these proteins are sliding. Something to note is that all of these actions require ATP and need that to be able to move in any way. In cystic fibrosis, it's a genetic disease and it's caused by a mutation in a gene. This gene codes for a specific protein channel. So those membrane proteins that we talked about this week, this one specifically is for the movement of chloride ions. So in a normal gene, this channel is open. It allows chloride ions to go through it. In cystic fibrosis, this channel is closed. Because of that, the ions cannot move through and a buildup of mucus happens. This happens in different organs. Most specifically, you see a lot of talk about in the respiratory system, this built up of mucus. So anyone that has cystic fibrosis, they have to actually physically remove this mucus. So either like by patting on the back to loosen that mucus that accumulates. The next question was, how are organic molecules related to homeostasis? Before we were looking at the different levels of organization. Now we're specifically focusing on homeostasis. Anyone think of examples of this?
Well, we talked about sensing proteins, and humans use the different proteins that can sense what's going on in the environment to then cause a reaction, whether that be your hair standing up or goosebumps or whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. Those receptor proteins are very important for maintaining homeostasis, making sure homeostasis happens and is recognized. Any other examples?
If I'm just doing.
Go ahead. Did you have one? Okay, well, an example of one used in homeostasis is glycogen
Did you guys see my?
and insulin. So glycogen is our carbohydrate that's related to the organic molecule, and insulin is the protein. It's a protein hormone. So it's responsible, both of these are responsible for maintaining homeostasis. After a meal, your blood glucose is very high because you just broke down a lot of different foods into little pieces of glucose. So we have all this glucose ready from your food. could be glycogen, depending on what you eat. It could be starch if you ate a potato. After you have that raise in blood sugar, then insulin is then released. Insulin is a hormone which controls the intake of glucose into the cell or tissues. So what happens to blood glucose after insulin is released? It is taken up by the cell.
Are hormones manufactured in the cell as well?
Yes, they are usually, depending on what type they are, if they are protein or if they are more a lipid, they could be produced in the endoplasmic reticulum or the mitochondria, or if they're protein, then they would be by the ribosomes.
Okay.
I have a
So
question.
they can either be proteins or lipids.
Yes,
Okay.
I have a question.
go ahead.
So I was wondering for people who have, I think it's type 1 diabetes, the one where you have too much insulin. Is it that's the right one, right? Or is it diabetes type 2?
Type 2, your insulin has been overused, so it doesn't function anymore. In both cases, you need insulin.
Oh, sorry. Overconsumption of like glucose levels or glucose.
Okay, yeah.
That's which type?
Type 2.
Type 2. Okay. So let's say there was a scenario where a person who had type 2 diabetes basically had too much glucose levels in their blood. Basically, how much time would they have to regulate that before it was too late?
I don't know exactly like time in minutes. It depends on how much insulin or how much in their cells are actually intaking that glycogen or glucose.
But what would happen once they go from A to B? Like, would their body go into shock? Like, how would it work?
Yeah, exactly. Their body is going to go into the diabetic shock. And
Okay.
It's very hard to get out of that shock. Once it's surpassed that homeostatic level, that's when issues can occur. And it's worse if the blood glucose level gets too low. So if your cell is not taking in glucose, that's worse. So from like a first aid response, if you think someone's going into a diabetic shock, it doesn't matter if they're 1 or 2, you should always right away give them sugar, because it's not going to affect them as much if they're already at their capacity. But if they're too low, that's when things can be really bad.
I have another question too. Sorry for all the questions.
Well, that's okay.
If let's say you're in the forest for some reason, and then you find someone and they're like severely dehydrated, and also they need like to up their glucose levels, why do some people suggest to make sure someone is hydrated before they eat?
Part of that is probably to do with how water is such an important or essential for all chemical reactions. We need water to complete those reactions. So for the breakdown or use of glucose, we still need water. We still need that electrolyte balance.
So what if you had water after, like what if you ate first and then drank water? Would that be bad, or would it just cause your body to not still be like hungry or not have enough energy?
I'm not 100% sure about that. I can look into that, but the whole point of water is to, it's hard for your body to do anything if it's low on water. So they maybe think that if you replenish the water first, then eats, then you'll be able to actually break down that food better. But I can look into that. I think I've seen another hand raised.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what she was talking about kind of made me think of something kind of similar situation. If someone's like if you don't eat for like 16 hours or 17 hours and you eat again and you eat like a lot, or you eat something heavy, you'll get like stomach cramps and stuff. Why does that happen?
I assume, and I can look up for sure, but I would assume it's just because you're overloading your system. Your system, after fasting for that long, is used to nothing. So then
Okay.
dumping all of this sugar into the body, it has a hard time to actually digest all that.
Okay.
But I
Okay.
can look for sure. I'll get back to you guys.
I have a question, another one. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
So let's say we don't eat like a huge meal, like not like that big pizza that's on the slide, but just like a little meal. How long until our body usually feels hungry again? Like if we ate in small meals rather than like really, really large meals, which is super present now in like in society, if we ate like smaller meals, how hungry would when would our body like say, okay, I want more food? Like would it be at C, or would it be at like D or E?
According to like the blood glucose,
Yeah.
anytime it's going to like, so let's say 90 is like the good range. Anytime it dips below, it's going to start to say, your body's going to start to want food.
Okay.
As far as you're talking about, that might be more so to do with the stomach and the receptors in the stomach. So if you've stretched those receptors, then any slight change might make you hungry again because you've stretched your stomach.
Okay.
Whereas when you eat smaller meals more consistently, you're not as hungry because your receptors aren't.
Also, sorry, I wanted to ask one more thing. Is this graph sort of a reason to explain how sometimes when you're super, super, super hungry, you just stop being hungry? Because like the blood glucose levels goes up, or it just gets to the point where your body goes into shock.
So this would actually be is after you eat. So you eat, your blood glucose is really high.
Yeah, but I mean, like let's say you don't eat for a while. Is that why, like you go to C and then you get hungry at C and then you go to D and then, okay, well, it's above 90, so you're not hungry anymore? Is that how it works?
That is probably just because your body's, it's been telling you and telling you and telling you, and then you just start to ignore the signs. But this graph is more saying at A, you eat something. So when you eat something, you have really high blood glucose. It goes back down after your cells accept it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sorry, is there a meal being eaten at C in order for the blood sugar to go up to D? Or is at C, the insulin is just retracted from the blood, allowing the glucose to just continue?
So yeah, definitely A, you eat, your glucose is up because you ate the meal, down because it's in your cell now, and then insulin is no longer released, like you said. The blood glucose goes back up because there's no more going into the cell.
There's no meal being eaten at C.
Yeah,
That's the whole thing. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I understand.
where she was getting confused. It's not another meal here.
That your body overproduces insulin, that goes below, stops producing insulin, and now the blood sugar goes back up, then back down around equilibrium or homeostasis, I guess. Okay.
Here's a little animation that's showing it. After a meal, blood glucose is high, the hormone insulin is released. Insulin binds to the receptor that allows that signal to be introduced inside of the cell, and then your glucose channels open, letting the glucose in, and the result is an increased intake by the cell. So this is the insulin fitting in, and then it disappears. Then it allows the channels to open, or tells the channels to open. Another homeostasis example is calcium levels. Anyone know why calcium is important to the body?
For your bones.
Bone structure and strength.
Yeah, that's one of the main ones, bones.
Also used in your neurons, I think, for like acting as with the neurotransmitters.
Exactly, yeah. So it's really important for this part, the transfer between neurons. And specifically, this parathyroid hormone, a protein hormone, is secreted when calcium gets too low. It tells the body to break down bone tissues, which would increase calcium. It tells it to increase the absorption of calcium in the digestive system, and also decreases a loss of calcium in urine. So in the nephron in your kidney, it would open up or make more calcium channels to allow more calcium into your blood, increasing the calcium level, raising it back up to homeostasis.
So that hormone like eats our bones?
Well, not necessarily eats it, but it causes the bones to release calcium or break down to release some calcium.
Okay.
Is calcium when calcium is released, it goes to when it's released from the bones, it goes to like does it not help like the digestive system? Or like when it's released, why does it get released? Like I know we talked about neurons, but is there anything else that like your body's like, oh, I need calcium for this, gets released from bone and it goes there?
Yeah, the other one, so neurons is as important, but also muscle contractions need calcium.
Muscle contractions, okay.
Forgot about that. That's why the heart's here.
Okay.
I'm going to stop here for today, but if you have the chance, I'll post the answers to these. Hopefully you've already done those. There's 2 slides here that look at practicing membrane transport. So we can take this up next week too.